Hi everyone, my name is Ayandra Kaiwa, and I'm going to be taking you guys through the Fair Information Practice Principles and how it can compare to other privacy policies, regulations, or laws. So having to explore the Fair Information Practice Principles is such an essential foundational knowledge to have, since it has a great influence as to how a company or organization is going to go about managing the sensitive data that they are accountable for, according to NCIDT. And this is why it is important to know FIPPS so that they can be more mindful and responsible with data management. All right, so let me go ahead and walk you guys through the 9 key fair information practice principles that you should know. And before I jump into it, just keep in mind that this is according to NCDIT. And I'm going to go ahead and start off with talking about transparency. So transparency is when an organization would have to be mindful to give the respect of letting users or the customers be informed clearly on what personal information you are collecting off of them. So what will happen to their personal data, where it's being sent off to, all of this, it has to be clear to them. So it would also be a good idea to let them know that how the data is actually being managed as well. And this is just being very clear with the user so that they aren't left perplexed or confused as to what is going on with their own personal information. And the next one I'm talking about would be individual protections. Individual protection is when people individually are given the right to have a say in the matter of how their personal information is being utilized and distributed. This can be through asking for their consent, fixing errors, being able to see their own data, and so on. And the next one is purpose specification. So this is more on the why aspect. In regards to collecting information, it has to be very clear, have a very valid reasoning behind why exactly the data is being retrieved. The purpose here is to have sort of a restriction made on organizations so that they aren't just using data for whatever reason. So in the future, they won't be able to utilize your data for unnecessary reasons, and they do take consent as priority. Now, number 4 is data minimization. This is when a company asks for information that is strictly needed to carry out their intended purpose with that information. So the reasoning behind this is that if there were to have a breach to occur, then having collected as little amount of data could help protect those users in any future incidents that were to occur. Number 5, we have use limitation, and this is when personal information of users being utilized in only the ways that it is in alignment with their intended purpose. So now if they wanted to use it for another different purpose, they would have to ask the consent of the users first before proceeding. Then number 6, we have data quality and integrity. This is made for the purpose of avoiding falling into mistakes if the data that they gathered was false or incorrect. So if we were to have our information collected, we would want to have it collected in the right and correct manner. And that's what this is for. It's to help highlight the importance of verifying the personal data that is in fact correct and up to date. The next one, number 7, is security. And security is to protect the data now with the right management in place, defensive measures, and the right access controls. Having this is just to secure the data and bring as much protection to the data that you are collecting off of users. Number 8, we have accountability, and this is when organizations adhering and following along the privacy guidelines and having those repercussions put on any employees who cross those boundaries or violates this. This is a great one to have because if there wasn't an accountability, a lot of the people wouldn't really be taking this seriously, the Fair Information Practice Principles. And then lastly, we have auditing. Auditing is for organizations that continuously review the privacy practices and see if they are running smoothly, efficiently, and effectively. This can actually help find the areas to enhance, which is very helpful. So now that I've kind of went over the key principles, I kind of want to shift over and speak on the Fair Information Practice Principles and how they would compare to other privacy laws, policies, regulations. Many of these laws and regulations have the Fair Information Practice Principles as their foundation. So for instance, the GDPR represents the Fair Information Practice Principles mentioned earlier. are seen here since it does have limitations placed on data being gathered, having a valid, clear purpose specification, and making sure there's a strong sense of transparency there. The next one is HIPAA. So HIPAA wants to protect healthcare data, and that's their intended goal for others. So this would need the fair information practice principles here again, because it needs to have a strong, robust accountability. It needs to limit how patients' data is being used and where it's being shared to. And the consent of patients would be needed before sharing any of the personal data, and there would be a strong security controls implemented in this as well. So lastly, there is the California Consumer Privacy Act, and according to BONTA 2024, it gives consumers more control of what is being changed and what happens with their personal data. So it's giving them the right to know what is being collected, the right to delete any collected information, the right to opt out, the right to even have non-discrimination. So this shows the fair information practice principles by representing different principles such as the individual protection, use limitation, data quality, and integrity. These are all different types of principles that are being incorporated, as you could tell, with the California Consumer Privacy Act. So next up, I would want to talk about the fair information practice principles and how it protects the personally identifiable information and how the federal agencies can apply them. So to start off, transparency can be applied through the posting of public notices and privacy impact assessments so that there is more clarity in the sharing of data. So according to fpc.gov, it states that agencies should be transparent about information policies and practices with respect to PII and should provide clear and accessible notice regarding creation, collection, use, processing, storage, maintenance, dissemination, and disclosure of PII. So next one is individual participation, and this is when it permits the consumers to be able to have access to their own data and records for when they need to go through the online portals to ask for any corrections to be made. This is specifically seen with the citizen access portals in federal agencies. So the next one is purpose specification. And this is when you ask for the federal agencies to have an evident explanation for the reasoning behind the rationale for why the data was gathered from applications, forms, and so on. And this can be needed, for instance, for federal forms specifically. And for the next one, for data minimization, it's all about just requesting needed information and avoiding collecting just excess or extra or just information that's just not necessary for federal agencies. And the next one is, of course, use limitation. So this indicates that the agencies are only to be sharing or using the PII for the reason that it was gathered. The only exception, of course, here is that if they got permission later on to use it in a different way, but of course that would require the consent of the users first. Now for data quality and integrity, it touches on the PII being kept in the records with the correct information and having to continuously check on this and make sure that it's up to date for federal agencies. And then for the security purposes, well, this is when you are actually implementing security controls like multi-factor authentication, it could be encryption, it could be monitoring, and it can even be access controls to make sure that personally identifiable information is being protected through those technical safeguards. Now for accountability, it's kind of touching on employee training. So there are going to be employee trainings, and this is when that comes into play. And these trainings are to make sure that the employees are knowledgeable in what confidentiality policies are and what would be considered a violation of those policies. So having this can allow them to know how it's going to be addressed as well. This is really important just so that everyone is aware of how they're accountable for this, for themselves and for others. And then lastly here is auditing. So auditing consists of having continuously scheduled reviews. So two of the ones that are considered and you need to keep in mind is the Department of Homeland Security and of course Office of Management and Budget reviews. Those are two of the reviews that are seen through the federal agencies and how it can be applied there. And then these are just done to keep tabs on if those privacy standards are being met. So with the application of these principles, it helps the federal agencies to now be able to strengthen their ability to protect sensitive data. So it helps protect the personal identifiable information. It reduces the risk of breaches. It helps that the personal data of the citizens being handled with care, attentiveness, ethically, and properly. So overall, Fair Information Practice Principles is clearly such an important guide when it comes to us as professionals, for federal agencies, and even organizations. So it helps build that trust that such personal data is being protected for both the citizens and organizations within federal agencies as well. So that would be all for today, but I do hope that you carry what was learned today with you, and thank you.